Richard Stevens stood in the marble lobby of Stevens and Associates, his hand intertwined with his secretary Amanda's, announcing to the entire staff that he was dumping his pregnant wife to marry his secretary. But what he didn't know was that the woman he called worthless during their brutal divorce was actually the secret CEO of his company, operating under a shell corporation that owned 87% of his firm's shares. For 5 years, Elizabeth had hidden her multi-billion-dollar trust fund inheritance, working as a simple housewife while secretly controlling the very empire her husband bragged about building. But now, 8 months pregnant with his child, she stood in the shadows of the executive floor, watching him celebrate his betrayal with the woman who had no idea she was dancing with a man who owned nothing. Richard had called Elizabeth worthless that morning, screaming that she contributed nothing to their marriage, that she was just a burden he had carried for too long. But the documents in Elizabeth's attorney's briefcase told a different story, one that would destroy everything Richard thought he knew about power, control, and the quiet woman he had underestimated for half a decade. Amanda smiled at Richard with victory in her eyes, believing she had won the ultimate prize, but neither she nor Richard could see the security footage being compiled, the board meeting being scheduled, or the revelation that would strip Richard of everything he held dear in exactly 72 hours. What would Richard do when he discovered that his pregnant wife was not only the secret CEO, but also the sole inheritor of the Whitmore fortune, the same family whose investment had saved his company from bankruptcy 3 years ago? How would Amanda react when she learned that the man she was marrying was about to lose his company, his reputation, and his freedom? And what revenge had Elizabeth planned during those long nights when Richard came home late, smelling of Amanda's perfume, while Elizabeth sat in their home office, moving pieces on a chessboard her husband never knew existed? Richard Stevens had always believed that success was something you built with your own hands, but the foundation of his empire rested on a lie he never bothered to uncover. The morning of his betrayal began like any other, with Elizabeth making breakfast in their Connecticut estate, her pregnant belly pressing against the marble counter as she scrambled eggs she wouldn't eat. But Richard barely glanced at her as he scrolled through his phone, responding to messages from Amanda that made him smile in ways his wife hadn't seen in years. "I'm leaving you," Richard announced between sips of coffee, his tone casual as if he were discussing the weather. But Elizabeth's hand froze on the spatula, her knuckles white against the handle. "I've filed for divorce. I want you out of the house by Friday." Elizabeth turned slowly, her 8-month pregnant frame silhouetted against the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, but her face remained composed, a mask she had perfected over 5 years of marriage to a man who never truly saw her. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Does it matter?" Richard stood, buttoning his Tom Ford suit jacket with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. But he failed to notice the way Elizabeth's eyes tracked his movement, calculating, measuring, remembering. "You've been worthless as a wife. No career, no ambition, just sitting around spending my money while contributing nothing to this marriage." The word worthless hung in the air like a poison, but Elizabeth absorbed it without flinching, having heard variations of it for months as Richard's affair with Amanda intensified. What Richard didn't know, what he had never known, was that Elizabeth Whitmore Stevens came from one of the oldest and wealthiest families in America. But she had hidden her multi-billion-dollar trust fund inheritance because she wanted to know if Richard loved her for herself, not her money. "I'm pregnant with your child," Elizabeth said softly, her hand moving to her belly, but Richard's expression hardened rather than softened. "That changes nothing. Amanda and I are getting married next month. She's everything you're not: ambitious, driven, beautiful." Richard grabbed his briefcase, the same Italian leather case Elizabeth had given him for their third anniversary, bought with money from an account he didn't know existed. My lawyers will be in touch. Sign the papers, take the settlement I'm offering, and disappear quietly. It's more than you deserve. The door slammed behind him, leaving Elizabeth alone in the kitchen of the house she had purchased under a shell corporation, standing on floors she owned, surrounded by walls that belonged to her. But Richard believed he had built this life with his own success. Elizabeth's hand trembled as she pulled out her phone, not to call her mother or her sister, but to dial a number that connected directly to Walter Morrison, the silver-haired attorney who had managed her family's affairs for 40 years. "It's time," Elizabeth said simply, but those two words carried the weight of 5 years of calculated patience. "Initiate protocol Whitmore." Walter's response was immediate, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that Elizabeth had rarely heard from the typically reserved lawyer. "I'll have the board assembled within 48 hours. The documentation is ready. Mrs. Stevens, are you absolutely certain? Once we begin, there's no going back." Elizabeth looked around the kitchen where she had played the role of devoted housewife, while secretly running a business empire that dwarfed her husband's company. But now the performance was over. "He called me worthless, Walter. He's dumping me while I'm 8 months pregnant with his child to marry his secretary. I think we're past the point of reconciliation." What Richard didn't know as he drove to Stevens and Associates that morning was that his wife had not been idle during their marriage, but had instead been building and acquiring, learning and strategizing, preparing for a day she hoped would never come, but knew eventually would. The Whitmore Family Trust Fund that Elizabeth had inherited on her 25th birthday was worth $8.7 billion, but Elizabeth hadn't been content to simply sit on inherited wealth. She had invested, grown it, and used it to acquire controlling interests in dozens of companies, including the venture capital firm that owned 87% of Stevens and Associates. Richard parked his Mercedes in the executive spot, the same spot he parked in every day, never knowing that the parking garage, the building, and the company inside all ultimately belonged to his pregnant wife. But his ignorance was about to become very expensive. Amanda greeted him in the lobby, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her dress tailored to accentuate curves that Richard had explored in hotel rooms across the city. But neither of them noticed the security guard in the corner, adjusting a camera that was recording everything. "Did you tell her?" Amanda asked, her voice breathy with excitement, but also tinged with the predatory satisfaction of a woman who thought she had won. "It's done. She'll be gone by Friday." Richard pulled Amanda close, kissing her in the lobby where any of his 300 employees might see, but that was the point. He wanted everyone to know that he was moving on, trading up, choosing ambition over domestic mediocrity. What Richard and Amanda didn't see was the elderly man in the corner of the lobby, his gray suit expensive but understated, his presence so unremarkable that most people looked right through him. But Walter Morrison had not become one of America's most feared corporate attorneys by being noticeable. He watched Richard kiss Amanda, watched them walk hand in hand to the elevator, and made notes on a tablet that would become evidence in proceedings Richard didn't yet know were coming. The morning progressed with Richard feeling lighter than he had in years, but that lightness came from ignorance, not liberation. He held meetings, made decisions, signed contracts, all while believing he was the master of his domain. But every signature, every decision, every move was being documented by people who answered to someone else. "Mr. Stevens, there's a board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning," his assistant Jenny said nervously, appearing in his doorway with a troubled expression, but Richard waved her off dismissively. "I didn't call a board meeting. Cancel it." Richard didn't look up from his computer, where he was planning the announcement of his engagement to Amanda, but Jenny didn't move. "Sir, I didn't schedule it. It came from the primary shareholders. It's mandatory. They've requested your presence at 9 a.m. sharp." Jenny's voice carried a note of concern that should have warned Richard, but he was too caught up in his own plans to notice. "Who scheduled it? Thompson? Martinez?" Richard finally looked up, irritation crossing his features, but Jenny shook her head. "The notice came from Morrison and Associates. They represent the Venture Core Capital Group, the firm that owns most of our shares." Jenny placed a formal letter on Richard's desk, the letterhead embossed with gold that caught the light, but Richard barely glanced at it. "Fine, I'll be there. But someone's going to answer for scheduling meetings without consulting me first." Richard returned to his computer, but if he had read the letter carefully, if he had paid attention to the signature at the bottom, he might have recognized the name of the attorney who had witnessed his wedding to Elizabeth 5 years ago. That evening, Richard took Amanda to Circo, the most expensive restaurant in the city, where they celebrated his freedom and their future. But 3 tables away, Walter Morrison sat alone, eating slowly, watching them through glasses that hid eyes that missed nothing. Richard ordered champagne, toasted to new beginnings, and told Amanda about the company he had built from nothing. But every word was a lie he didn't know he was telling. "You're brilliant," Amanda cooed, her hand covering Richard's across the white tablecloth, but her admiration was based on a fiction that would collapse within 24 hours. Building a company like Stevens and Associates from scratch, it's incredible. Richard smiled, accepting praise for achievements that were not entirely his own, but he had told the story so many times that he had started to believe it himself. What he had forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood, was that his company had nearly failed 3 years ago, had been on the brink of bankruptcy when a mysterious investor group had purchased 87% of his shares for $200 million, saving the company but stripping Richard of actual control. "The investor group has been hands-off," Richard had told himself and others, believing that his talent had made them money, that they trusted his vision. But the truth was far more complex. Elizabeth had watched her husband's company failing, had seen him drowning in debt and bad decisions, and had made the choice to save him, not because she was weak or subservient, but because she loved him and believed he could change. But Richard hadn't changed, but had instead interpreted her rescue as validation of his own genius, and had used his second chance to build an ego that ultimately led him straight into Amanda's ambitious arms. While Richard and Amanda celebrated, Elizabeth sat in a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, an apartment Richard didn't know she owned, meeting with Walter Morrison and a team of attorneys who had spent 5 years documenting everything Richard had done. The conference table was covered with folders, each one containing evidence of Richard's affair, his financial mismanagement, his attempts to hide assets from his pregnant wife. But Elizabeth felt no satisfaction looking at them. "The board meeting is set for 9 a.m., Walter said, his voice gentle despite the violence of what they were planning. "The other board members have been informed of your identity. They're shocked but supportive. Stevens and Associates has been profitable under the management you've directed from behind the scenes." Elizabeth nodded, her hand resting on her pregnant belly where her daughter kicked, a daughter who would grow up knowing her father had called her mother worthless, but would also know that her mother had the strength to prove him catastrophically wrong. "And the divorce proceedings? Judge Harrison has agreed to hear the case personally, given your pregnancy and Mr. Stevens's adultery, combined with his attempts to minimize your settlement based on fraudulent claims about company ownership. She's prepared to be unsympathetic to his position." Walter allowed himself a small smile, but Elizabeth's face remained serious. "I don't want to destroy him," Elizabeth said quietly, but the other attorneys in the room exchanged skeptical glances. I want him to understand. I want him to see what he threw away. I want him to know that love and loyalty are worth more than ambition and appearance. Mrs. Stevens, Walter said carefully, with respect, after tomorrow morning, Mr. Stevens will be destroyed whether you intend it or not. When he learns that you own his company, that you've been the hidden hand guiding every major decision for 3 years, that the success he's been claiming as his own was actually your strategic vision. That knowledge alone will break him. Elizabeth closed her eyes, remembering the man she had married 5 years ago, the ambitious but kind executive who had treated her with respect and tenderness. But that man had been slowly consumed by success until only the arrogance remained. Then let him break. Maybe it's the only way he'll learn to value what matters. The next morning arrived with autumn rain that matched the storm about to break over Richard Stevens' life. But he walked into the Stevens & Associates building with confidence, annoyed by the mandatory meeting but unconcerned about its purpose. Amanda walked beside him, having stayed the night at his apartment, her presence a declaration that Richard no longer hid his affair but embraced it publicly. "I'll wait in your office," Amanda said, kissing Richard's cheek, but he shook his head. "Come with me. I want the board to meet you. You'll be my wife soon. You should know the people who help run my company." Richard's possessive language, "my company," would have been almost funny if it weren't so tragic. But Amanda smiled and followed him to the 10th floor conference room, where the board meeting was scheduled. The conference room was already full when Richard arrived, but something was wrong in a way he couldn't immediately identify. The usual board members were there: Thompson, Martinez, Chen, Okafor, but there were also people Richard didn't recognize, including Walter Morrison, whose presence should have warned Richard that this was not a normal meeting. "Richard, please sit down," Thompson said, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes wouldn't meet Richard's, and that should have been another warning. "What's going on? Who are all these people?" Richard remained standing, his instinct for self-preservation finally beginning to trigger, but it was far too late. "Mr. Stevens, I'm Walter Morrison, senior partner at Morrison & Associates. I represent Venture Core Capital Group, the majority shareholder of Stevens & Associates." Walter stood, his presence commanding despite his elderly appearance, but his voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "We've called this meeting to discuss a change in company leadership." "Change in leadership? This is my company. I built it from nothing." Richard's voice rose, his confidence cracking, but Amanda grabbed his arm, her own face pale as she began to understand that something was very wrong. "Actually, Mr. Stevens, that's not quite accurate." Walter opened a folder, his movements deliberate and theatrical, but the documents he revealed were authentic and devastating. 3 years ago, Stevens & Associates was $47 million in debt and facing bankruptcy. Venture Core Capital purchased 87% of company shares for $200 million, effectively saving the company but stripping you of majority control. "I know that," Richard snapped, but his hands were shaking. "But the investor group has been silent partners. I run this company. I make the decisions. You've been permitted to make operational decisions, but all major strategic initiatives for the past 3 years have been reviewed and approved by Venture Core Capital's managing director." Walter paused, letting the word "permitted" sink in, but Richard was still too deep in denial to understand. "That managing director has decided that your recent personal choices represent a liability to the company." "My personal life is none of your business," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction, and Amanda's grip on his arm tightened. "When your personal choices involve abandoning your pregnant wife, conducting an affair with a subordinate employee, and creating a hostile work environment through inappropriate workplace relationships, They become very much the company's business. Walter's voice hardened, but he was just warming up. However, those issues pale in comparison to the financial irregularities we've discovered. Richard's face went white, but he managed to speak. What irregularities? My books are clean. I've done nothing wrong. You've been moving company assets into personal accounts. You've been using corporate funds for personal expenses, including hotel rooms for your extramarital affair. You've been preparing to hide community assets from your wife in anticipation of divorce proceedings. Would you like me to continue? Walter's litany of crimes was damning, but Richard tried to bluster through. I'm the CEO. I'm entitled to certain discretionary expenses, and my divorce is my business. Richard looked around the room for support, but every board member avoided his gaze, their silence more damning than any accusation. You were the CEO, Walter corrected, emphasis on the past tense, but Richard wasn't ready to accept what was happening. As of this morning, the board has voted unanimously to remove you from that position, effective immediately. You can't do this. I'll sue. I'll fight this. You have no grounds. Richard's protests were cut off by the conference room door opening, but the person who entered stopped his heart. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, 8 months pregnant, wearing a charcoal gray suit that spoke of power and money, her hair pulled back to reveal the face Richard had dismissed that very morning. But now she looked like someone completely different. Behind her stood 2 more attorneys, their briefcases undoubtedly full of more documents that would bury Richard deeper. Hello, Richard, Elizabeth said quietly, moving into the room with a grace that seemed impossible for someone so heavily pregnant, but every eye in the room tracked her movement with respect. I believe we have some things to discuss. Richard's mouth opened and closed, his brain struggling to process his wife's presence at a board meeting for his company, but Amanda found her voice first. What is she doing here? Security should remove her. Security answers to me, Elizabeth said, her eyes never leaving Richard's face, but her voice carried absolute authority. As does everyone else in this building. I don't understand, Richard whispered, but the pieces were beginning to fall into place in a pattern that threatened to destroy him. Elizabeth, what are you doing here? Mr. Stevens, allow me to introduce Elizabeth Whitmore Stevens, the sole owner and managing director of Venture Core Capital Group. Walter's introduction was formal, but his eyes gleamed with satisfaction, and Richard felt the floor drop out from under his world. That's impossible, Richard said, but his voice was hollow. You're just worthless? Elizabeth supplied the word Richard had used that morning, but her tone was ice. A burden? Someone who contributes nothing. Please, Richard, finish your sentence. The silence in the room was absolute, but Richard's mind was racing, trying to understand how the woman he had dismissed as a housewife could be standing before him as the owner of his company. You own Venture Core? I am Venture Core. I created it 6 years ago as a vehicle for my family's trust fund investments. Elizabeth moved to the head of the conference table, the position Richard usually occupied, but she belonged there in a way he never had. The Whitmore Family Trust Fund, which I inherited when I turned 25, is currently valued at approximately $8.7 billion. Venture Core manages about half of that. Richard's legs gave out, and he collapsed into a chair, his face ashen, but Elizabeth wasn't finished. 3 years ago, when your company was failing, when you had made a series of poor decisions that put Stevens and Associates on the brink of bankruptcy, I intervened. I purchased 87% of company shares for $200 million, saving your company and your reputation. Why? The word came out as a croak, but Richard needed to understand. Why would you do that? Because I loved you, Elizabeth said simply, but the past tense was deliberate and cruel. Because I believed in you, because I thought that with proper guidance and capital, you could build something great. And you did, with my money, my strategic vision, my connections, and my intervention in every major decision you've made for 3 years. Amanda spoke up, her voice shrill with panic. Richard, tell them this is crazy. Tell them. Shut up, Amanda. Richard's command was automatic, his focus entirely on Elizabeth, but his mistress's wounded expression suggested she was beginning to realize she had bet on the wrong horse. Elizabeth, I didn't know. If I had known who you were, you would have married me for my money instead of for love. Elizabeth's laugh was bitter, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. That's exactly why I hid it, Richard. I wanted to know if you could love me for myself, and for 2 years you did. But then success changed you, or maybe it just revealed who you always were. I can fix this, Richard said desperately, rising from his chair, but Walter Morrison moved to block his path to Elizabeth. We can work this out. I made a mistake. Amanda means nothing. Don't lie, Elizabeth said sharply. Amanda means a great deal to you. She's ambitious, beautiful, driven, all the things you said I'm not. But what you failed to notice is that Amanda is also calculating, manipulative, and only interested in what you can give her. All eyes turned to Amanda, who had gone pale, but her expression was defiant rather than ashamed. At least I didn't lie about who I was. At least Richard knew what he was getting with me. Did he? Elizabeth's smile was sharp. Did Richard know that you're currently $300,000 in debt? That you've been stealing from the company to pay off your creditors? That you've been feeding information about Stevens and Associates deals to competitors in exchange for money? The room exploded with noise as the board members reacted to this revelation, but Amanda's face confirmed the truth of Elizabeth's accusations. You can't prove any of that, Amanda said, but her voice shook. I can prove all of it, Elizabeth replied calmly. I've had investigators watching you for 6 months, Amanda. Every meeting with competitors, every stolen document, every wire transfer, it's all documented. You're looking at criminal charges for corporate espionage and embezzlement. Richard turned to Amanda with betrayal written across his face, but she backed away from him, her eyes darting toward the door. Richard, don't listen to her. She's lying to split us up. Security, Elizabeth said quietly, but 2 large men in suits immediately entered the conference room, moving to flank Amanda. Please escort Ms. Carter from the building. The police will want to speak with her regarding the evidence we've compiled. Amanda's departure was less dignified than her arrival, her protests fading as security led her away, but Richard barely noticed, his world having shrunk to the woman standing before him. Elizabeth, please. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but we can fix this. Think of our child. I am thinking of our child, Elizabeth said, her hand moving protectively to her belly. I'm thinking about what kind of father you'll be, what kind of man you'll teach our daughter to respect. And right now, Richard, you're teaching her that it's acceptable to abandon people when they're vulnerable, to betray trust, to value appearance over substance. I'll change, Richard pleaded, but Elizabeth shook her head. You'll change because you've been caught, because you've lost everything. That's not real change, Richard. That's just fear. Elizabeth turned to Walter. Mr. Morrison, please proceed with the termination paperwork. Wait, Richard said desperately. You're firing me from my own company. It's not your company, Elizabeth said gently, but the words were devastating. It never was. It's my company. You were just managing it, and you've proven you can't be trusted with that responsibility. Walter cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the formal proceedings. Mr. Stevens, the board has voted to terminate your employment with Stevens and Associates effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks severance pay, which is generous given the circumstances. All company property, including your laptop, phone, and access cards, must be surrendered before you leave the building today. You're giving me 2 weeks severance after everything I've done for this company?" Richard's voice rose with indignation, but the irony of his complaint seemed lost on him. "After everything you've stolen from this company, you should be grateful we're not pressing criminal charges," Thompson spoke up, finding his courage now that Richard's power had been broken. "We could have you arrested for embezzlement, fraud, and misappropriation of corporate assets." Richard's face crumbled, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his denial, but he tried one more time to reach Elizabeth. "What about us? Our marriage? Our child?" "Our marriage is over. The divorce papers are being filed today. As for our child, you'll have supervised visitation rights until you can prove you're capable of being a responsible parent." Elizabeth's voice softened slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. "Richard, I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because you need to understand that actions have consequences. You threw away our marriage for an affair with a woman who was stealing from you. You called me worthless when I was carrying your child. You need to face what you've done." "I've lost everything," Richard whispered, the weight of his fall finally crushing him, but Elizabeth shook her head. "No, you've lost the illusion of everything. The company was never truly yours. The house we lived in, I own it. The cars, the investments, the lifestyle you thought you'd built, all of it came from my money, my decisions, my work." Elizabeth paused, letting this sink in, but her next words carried a note of something almost like kindness. "But you haven't lost everything, Richard. You still have the chance to become a better man, to be a good father to our daughter, to rebuild yourself on honest foundations instead of lies and arrogance." Richard looked at Elizabeth, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time in years, but what he saw broke something fundamental inside him. She was brilliant, powerful, and beautiful in ways he had been too blind to recognize, but he had thrown her away for a cheap imitation because his ego needed constant validation. "I'm sorry," he said, but the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of his betrayal. "I know you are," Elizabeth said sadly, "but sorry isn't enough. Sorry doesn't undo what you've done. Sorry doesn't change the fact that when I needed you most, when I was pregnant and vulnerable, you abandoned me and called me worthless." The board meeting concluded with the formal paperwork being signed, Richard's employment being terminated, and his access to the company being revoked, but the personal devastation would take much longer to process. As Richard was escorted from the building by security, stripped of his executive privileges and his illusions, he passed employees who had once feared and respected him, but now they only whispered and stared. In the weeks that followed, the full scope of Elizabeth's wealth and power became public knowledge, creating a media firestorm that Richard had to weather from a small apartment he could barely afford. The house in Connecticut was Elizabeth's property. The cars had been leased through her companies, and the bank accounts he thought were his turned out to be marital assets, heavily weighted toward his wife's contributions. The divorce proceedings were brutal, with Judge Harrison showing little sympathy for a man who had abandoned his pregnant wife for his secretary. The prenuptial agreement Richard had insisted Elizabeth sign turned out to be worthless, as it had been based on fraudulent claims about asset ownership. But even without it, Elizabeth's wealth had been kept so separate from the marriage that Richard had no legitimate claim to any of it. Amanda was arrested and charged with corporate espionage and embezzlement. Her trial, a cautionary tale covered extensively by the business press. But Richard felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a hollow recognition that he had been played as thoroughly as he had played his wife. The woman he had thought was ambitious and driven turned out to be desperate and corrupt, attracted not to Richard himself but to the power and money she thought he possessed. Stevens and Associates thrived under new management, with Elizabeth eventually revealing her ownership and taking an active public role in the company's direction, but she renamed it Venture Core Technologies, erasing Richard's name from the business he thought he had built. The company's stock price soared as investors recognized Elizabeth's Midas touch, but Richard could only watch from the outside as the empire that should have been his partnership flourished without him. 3 months after the board meeting, Elizabeth gave birth to a healthy baby girl she named Charlotte, but Richard was not present for the birth, having been granted only supervised visitation rights due to his unstable mental state following his fall. When he finally met his daughter for the first time in a sterile visitation center with a social worker present, Richard broke down completely, sobbing into his hands as the magnitude of what he had lost overwhelmed him. "She's beautiful," Richard whispered, looking at Charlotte's tiny face, but Elizabeth's expression was guarded as she held their daughter. "She is," Elizabeth agreed, but she didn't offer to let Richard hold Charlotte yet, the trust between them too damaged for such intimacy. "Richard, Dr. Chen says you've been attending therapy sessions. That's good. Charlotte needs a father who's working on himself." "I'm trying," Richard said, his voice broken. "Every day I wake up and remember what I had, what I threw away, and I want to die. But then I think about Charlotte, about being the father she deserves, and I keep going." Elizabeth's eyes softened slightly, but her guard remained up. "That's what being a parent means, Richard. Putting someone else first, doing the hard work even when it hurts, growing into someone worthy of their trust." "Will you ever forgive me?" The question came out raw and desperate, but Elizabeth took a long time to answer. "I don't know," she finally said. "Right now, I'm focused on Charlotte and rebuilding my life. Forgiveness is something that might come with time, but it can't be forced, and it doesn't mean we'll ever be together again." Richard nodded, accepting this, but his eyes remained on his daughter, memorizing every detail of her face. "I want to tell you something, and I need you to believe that I mean it. When I married you, I loved you. That wasn't a lie. But success poisoned me. It made me think I deserved more, that I was entitled to whatever I wanted. I forgot that the best thing I had wasn't the company or the money or the status. It was you. It was your love, your trust, your partnership. And I destroyed it because I was too arrogant to recognize its value." "That's probably the most honest thing you've said to me in years," Elizabeth said quietly, but there was no triumph in her voice, only sadness. "The question is whether you really believe it, or whether you just believe it now because you've lost everything." "I don't know," Richard admitted, the honesty painful. "I'd like to think I would have come to this realization eventually, that I would have recognized what I had before it was too late, but maybe I wouldn't have. Maybe some people only learn through loss." The visitation ended with Richard having held his daughter for exactly 15 minutes, every second precious, but as he left the center and returned to his small apartment, the weight of his choices pressed down on him. He had gone from a corner office to unemployment, from a mansion to a studio apartment, from married to divorced, from respected executive to cautionary tale. But the loss of material things wasn't what destroyed him. It was the loss of Elizabeth's respect, her love, and the future they could have had together. In the months and years that followed, Richard slowly rebuilt his life on more honest foundations, but he never recovered what he had lost. He found work at a mid-sized firm, not as CEO, but as a senior manager, his fall from grace making him humble in ways success never had, but the lessons came too late to save his marriage. Elizabeth moved on, eventually finding love with someone who valued her from the beginning, but she remained cordial with Richard for Charlotte's sake, allowing him increasing visitation as he proved himself capable of being a stable, responsible father. Charlotte grew up knowing both her parents, but the story of her father's betrayal and fall became a family legend. a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and the importance of recognizing value before it's lost. Richard's relationship with his daughter was loving but tinged with sadness, both of them aware that he had destroyed the family they could have had before Charlotte was even born. On Charlotte's 18th birthday, Richard wrote her a letter that he hoped would explain, if not excuse, his choices. In it, he detailed everything he had done wrong, every mistake he had made, every moment he had chosen pride over love. But he also wrote about the lessons he had learned and the man he had tried to become. The letter ended with a warning. Never take for granted the people who love you, never mistake success for character, and never, ever call someone worthless when you don't understand the full measure of their worth. I called your mother worthless, and she was worth more than I could ever comprehend. I hope you grow up to be more like her than like the man I was. Elizabeth read the letter after Charlotte shared it with her, sitting in the study of her Upper East Side penthouse, and for the first time in 18 years, she allowed herself to cry for the marriage that could have been. But she also felt gratitude that Richard's betrayal had freed her to build a life that was authentically hers, not hidden in the shadows of someone else's ego. The story of Richard Stevens became a business school case study, taught at Harvard and Wharton as a lesson in the importance of corporate governance, the dangers of executive narcissism, and the consequences of underestimating the people around you, but the human cost of his choices, the broken family, the trauma, the years of rebuilding, couldn't be captured in PowerPoint slides or academic papers. Amanda Carter served 3 years in prison for corporate espionage and embezzlement, her ambitious dreams destroyed by her own greed, but Richard never spoke to her again after her arrest, recognizing that she had been both perpetrator and symptom of his own moral decay. She had seen what he wanted to be, ruthless, ambitious, unencumbered by domestic responsibility, and had reflected it back to him, but the image had been false, a distortion that destroyed them both. Years later, when Richard was in his 60s and Charlotte had children of her own, he attended a business conference where Elizabeth was the keynote speaker, having become one of the most respected investors in America, but he sat in the back of the auditorium, watching her command the stage with a presence that would have intimidated the arrogant young CEO he had once been. After her speech, he approached her in the lobby, their first conversation in months. "You were brilliant up there," Richard said simply, but Elizabeth's smile was warm without being intimate. "Thank you, Richard. How are the grandkids?" The conversation was polite, civilized, the kind of interaction between people who shared history but not intimacy, but it was more than Richard deserved. "They're wonderful. Charlotte's doing an amazing job as a mother." Richard paused, gathering courage for what he needed to say. "Elizabeth, I know I've apologized 1,000 times, but I want you to know that not a day goes by when I don't think about what I destroyed. You gave me everything: love, support, financial security, strategic guidance, and I threw it all away because I was too proud to see what I had." Elizabeth studied him for a long moment, seeing the gray hair, the lines of age and regret, the humility that had replaced arrogance, but she also saw the young man she had once loved. "Richard, we were both young. We both made mistakes. You made bigger ones, more destructive ones, but dwelling on them doesn't help anyone. You've been a good father to Charlotte. You've rebuilt your life with integrity. That's what matters now." "I wasted so much time," Richard said quietly, but Elizabeth shook her head. "You learned lessons that many people never learn. You grew into someone better. That's not wasted time. That's transformation, even if it came through pain." Elizabeth glanced at her watch, her assistant hovering nearby. "I have to go, Richard, but I'm glad we talked. Give Charlotte my love." As Elizabeth walked away, surrounded by admirers and assistants, Richard watched her go and felt the familiar ache of lost possibilities. But he also felt something new: acceptance. He had called her worthless and discovered she was priceless. He had dumped her for his secretary and learned that ambition without character was empty. He had thought he was trading up and instead had traded away everything that mattered. The story of Richard Stevens and Elizabeth Whitmore became the kind of cautionary tale that people shared at cocktail parties and business dinners, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that arrogance comes before a fall, and that sometimes the quiet person in the corner is actually the most powerful person in the room. But for Richard, it was simply his life, a series of catastrophic choices that taught him too late what true worth really meant. In the end, Richard died at 73, having lived a life of quiet redemption after years of loud arrogance, but his legacy was complicated. To the business world, he was a cautionary tale. To his daughter and grandchildren, he was a loving, if flawed, family member who had learned hard lessons. And to Elizabeth, who attended his funeral with their daughter and spoke kindly of his later years, he was a reminder that people could change, even if that change came too late to save what they had destroyed. The last time Elizabeth thought about Richard was on her own deathbed, surrounded by her second husband's children and grandchildren, by Charlotte and her family, by the empire she had built through intelligence and integrity rather than arrogance and lies. But she allowed herself one moment of sadness for the young couple they had been, before success and secrets had poisoned their potential. She had called him to account, had shown him the cost of calling her worthless, but she had never stopped hoping he would become the man he could have been all along. The multi-billion-dollar trust fund Elizabeth had hidden from Richard was eventually split between Charlotte and various charitable foundations, funding scholarships for young women in business and supporting programs for families broken by divorce. But the most valuable inheritance Elizabeth left wasn't money. It was the lesson that true worth comes from character, not bank accounts, from integrity, not image, from substance, not show. Richard Stevens had learned that lesson the hardest way possible, but he had learned it nonetheless, and in the end, that transformation, painful, humiliating, devastating as it was, might have been the most valuable thing that ever happened to him, even though it cost him everything he thought he wanted and revealed the worthlessness of what he had chosen over love. 25 years after Richard's death, Charlotte Stevens Whitmore stood in the boardroom of VentureCore Technologies, now valued at over $50 billion, addressing a group of young executives who had gathered for the company's annual leadership summit. But her message wasn't about profit margins or market strategies. Behind her, projected on the screen, was a photograph of her mother and father on their wedding day, young, happy, unaware of the tragedy that awaited them. "My father called my mother worthless," Charlotte began, her voice steady despite the emotion threading through her words, but the room fell silent as the weight of that statement settled over the audience. He dumped his pregnant wife to marry his secretary, never knowing that the woman he dismissed was the secret CEO of his company and the inheritor of a multi-billion-dollar trust fund. He lost everything, his career, his marriage, his dignity, because he couldn't see the value of what he had until it was too late. Charlotte paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room full of ambitious young professionals who reminded her so much of her father at that age, but she hoped they would learn from his mistakes rather than repeat them. "This company exists because my mother believed in second chances. She could have destroyed my father completely, could have prosecuted him, could have ensured he never worked again. But she chose instead to teach him a lesson about worth, both his own and others. My father spent the rest of his life trying to become worthy of the love he had thrown away." A young woman in the front row raised her hand tentatively, but Charlotte nodded for her to speak. "Did your father ever forgive himself?" Charlotte smiled sadly, remembering the countless conversations she'd had with her father in his later years, the quiet moments when he would look at her with eyes full of regret and love. but also the peace he had eventually found. I don't think he ever fully forgave himself, but he learned to live with his mistakes and become someone better. He taught me that success means nothing if you achieve it by destroying the people who love you. He showed me that ambition without integrity is just another word for greed. And he proved that it's never too late to change, even if it's too late to undo what you've broken. Charlotte walked to the window overlooking Manhattan, the city where her father had once ruled a corner office and where her mother had secretly controlled an empire. But now both of them were gone, leaving Charlotte to carry forward the lessons learned through their pain. My mother's greatest achievement wasn't building Venture Corps or managing billions of dollars. It was teaching my father, and through him teaching me, that everyone has intrinsic worth that exists independent of their bank account, their job title, or their usefulness to others. When you call someone worthless, you reveal the poverty of your own soul, not theirs. The room remained silent as Charlotte returned to the podium, but her final words carried the weight of 2 generations of hard-won wisdom. So as you go forward in your careers, as you chase success and climb ladders and build empires, remember this: the people you dismiss today might be the ones who hold your future in their hands tomorrow. The spouse you take for granted might be the only thing standing between you and complete ruin. And the quiet person you underestimate might just be the most powerful person in the room, choosing to love you despite your blindness. Charlotte picked up the small box that had been sitting on the podium throughout her speech, opening it to reveal a simple gold wedding band, her father's ring, removed on the day he signed his divorce papers, but kept by her mother until her death, and then given to Charlotte with a note that read, "Remember what this represents, not the marriage we had, but the marriage we could have had if he had seen my worth sooner, and I had demanded respect from the beginning." "This is my inheritance," Charlotte said, holding up the ring so the light caught it, creating small rainbows that danced across the conference table. But the true inheritance was the story, the lesson, the cautionary tale that would be passed down through her family for generations. Not the billions of dollars, not the company, not the real estate or investments, but the knowledge that love is the only currency that matters, that integrity is the only foundation worth building on, and that true worth can never be diminished by someone else's inability to recognize it. As the executives began to shift in their seats, preparing to leave, a young man in an expensive suit raised his hand, his expression troubled, but Charlotte could see something of her father in his ambitious eyes. "Ms. Stevens Whitmore, with respect, isn't this story just about revenge? Your mother destroyed your father because he left her. Couldn't she have just let him go?" Charlotte had been waiting for this question, had known it would come from someone who hadn't yet learned the difference between consequence and revenge. But she took her time answering, wanting to get it exactly right. "My mother didn't destroy my father. My father destroyed himself. She simply removed the scaffolding of lies that was holding up his false image of success. And she didn't do it out of revenge, but out of necessity. My father was embezzling company funds, conducting an affair with an employee who was committing corporate espionage, and preparing to hide marital assets in an illegal divorce. My mother had a fiduciary responsibility to the company and its shareholders to act." The young man nodded slowly, but Charlotte could see he wasn't entirely convinced. So she continued, "But beyond the legal and financial reasons, my mother took action because she understood something fundamental about human nature. Sometimes people only learn through loss. My father had to lose everything he thought made him valuable before he could discover what actually made him worthy. It was the greatest gift my mother ever gave him, even though it felt like destruction at the time." An older woman near the back spoke up, her voice carrying the authority of experience, but also a note of pain that suggested personal connection to the story. I went through something similar 30 years ago. My husband left me for someone younger while I was pregnant with our second child. But I wasn't a secret billionaire. I was just a school teacher. I couldn't take his company away or reveal hidden power. I could only survive and raise my children alone while he built a new life. The room's energy shifted, becoming more intimate, but Charlotte moved closer to the woman, recognizing a kindred spirit in trauma. What happened to him? He married the other woman, had 2 more children, built a successful business. From the outside, it looked like he'd made the right choice, like leaving me had been his path to success. The woman's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. But 15 years later, his second wife left him for someone else. His children from that marriage barely spoke to him. His business partner embezzled millions, and he showed up at my door, broken, asking for forgiveness. "Did you forgive him?" Charlotte asked gently, but the woman's smile was complex, containing layers of emotion that couldn't be easily parsed. "Eventually, yes, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or reconciling. It just means releasing the poison of hatred so it doesn't destroy you too. My ex-husband learned his lessons the hard way, without anyone orchestrating his fall. Life itself taught him what he needed to know." The woman paused, her eyes meeting Charlotte's. "Your mother had resources I didn't have, but in the end, we both faced the same choice. Let bitterness consume us or rise above it and build something better." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away, maintaining her composure. "My mother used to say that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. She could have been indifferent to my father's fate, could have walked away and let him fail on his own, but she chose to create a teaching moment out of his betrayal. Not for his benefit alone, but for mine, for the company's employees, for everyone who would hear the story and hopefully make different choices." Another voice came from the middle of the room, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, but her question cut to the heart of the matter. "What about Amanda, the secretary? What happened to her after prison?" Charlotte had anticipated this question less, having rarely thought about the woman who had helped destroy her parents' marriage, but she had done her research before this presentation. Amanda Carter served 3 years in federal prison for corporate espionage and embezzlement. When she was released, she tried to rebuild her life, but the scandal followed her everywhere. She eventually moved to a small town in Oregon, changed her name, and worked as a bookkeeper for a local hardware store until she died of cancer at 52. "That seems harsh," the young woman said softly, but Charlotte shook her head. "Life is harsh. Consequences are harsh. Amanda made choices driven by greed and ambition without integrity, and those choices had consequences that lasted her entire life." Charlotte's voice hardened slightly, but then softened again. "That said, my mother sent Amanda money anonymously during her final illness, paying for treatments that Amanda's minimal insurance wouldn't cover, because even though Amanda had betrayed her, had stolen from her company, had tried to steal her husband, my mother understood that everyone deserves basic human dignity, especially at the end." The room absorbed this information in silence, but Charlotte could see the mental calculations happening behind dozens of pairs of eyes, people reassessing their assumptions about power, revenge, mercy, and justice. She let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of these revelations to settle fully before continuing. "My mother never told my father about helping Amanda," Charlotte said quietly. "She didn't do it for recognition or to prove anything. She did it because she had the resources to ease someone's suffering, and she believed that having resources created an obligation to use them wisely, even for people who had wronged her." A man in his 50s, distinguished-looking with silver hair, raised his hand, but his expression was troubled. "Ms. Stevens Whitmore, I have to confess something. Listening to your story, I see myself in your father. I've been married for 23 years. My wife gave up her career to raise our children while I built my business. And lately I've been thinking she's boring, that she doesn't understand my world anymore, that maybe I deserve someone more exciting. The confession hung in the air like a bomb, but Charlotte's expression remained compassionate rather than judgmental. What stopped you from acting on those thoughts? Fear, mostly, the man admitted, his voice rough. Fear that I'd lose my children's respect. Fear that I'd lose half my assets in a divorce. But hearing your story, I realize I've been afraid of the wrong things. I should be afraid of becoming your father, of waking up one day and realizing I threw away something precious because I was too arrogant to see its value. So what will you do? Charlotte asked, but she already knew the answer from the determination in his eyes. I'm going home tonight and telling my wife everything I've been feeling, not because I want permission to cheat, but because I want to save my marriage before these thoughts become actions. I want to remember why I fell in love with her in the first place. I want to see her the way your mother needed your father to see her, as a complete person with her own worth, not just as an accessory to my success. Charlotte nodded approvingly, but she held up a cautioning hand. That's good, but it's not enough. Saying the words is easy. Following through when it's inconvenient, when the exciting person is still tempting, when your ego wants validation, that's the hard part. My father said the right things after he lost everything, but he only said them because he had no other choice. The question is whether you can change while you still have something to lose. The man's face paled, but he nodded slowly, accepting the challenge inherent in Charlotte's words. I understand. Thank you for your honesty. As the presentation wound down, Charlotte felt the exhaustion that always came after telling her parents' story, but she also felt the familiar sense of purpose that made the emotional toll worthwhile. She had told this story hundreds of times over the years, in boardrooms, classrooms, conferences, and counseling sessions, but each telling reached different people at different moments in their lives, planting seeds that might prevent future tragedies. After the executives filed out, Charlotte remained in the boardroom, staring at the photograph of her young parents, but her reverie was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. An elderly man entered, moving slowly but with quiet dignity, his face weathered but kind. Ms. Stevens Whitmore, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I'm Walter Morrison. I was your mother's attorney. His voice was gentle, but Charlotte felt a jolt of recognition, having heard this man's name throughout her childhood as the architect of her father's downfall. Mr. Morrison, I thought you'd retired years ago, Charlotte said, standing to shake his hand, but the old lawyer smiled. I did retire 15 years ago, but I still live in the city, and when I heard you were giving this presentation, I had to come. I wanted to tell you something about your mother that I never told anyone else, not even your father. Walter moved to the window, his eyes distant with memory. The night before the board meeting where we revealed your mother's identity to your father, she called me at 2 a.m. She was crying, the only time I ever heard her cry in all the years I represented her. Charlotte felt her heart clench, imagining her mother alone in the night, pregnant and betrayed, but still she had remained strong enough to execute her plan. What did she say? She asked me if there was any other way, any path that didn't involve destroying your father's world. She still loved him, you see, even after everything he'd done. Even knowing about Amanda, even after he'd called her worthless, part of her wanted to find a way to save him without breaking him first. Walter's voice was thick with emotion, but he continued. I told her there wasn't another way, that your father had crossed too many lines, that he'd committed crimes that had to be addressed, that his arrogance had created a situation where only total exposure could correct the course. What did she say? Charlotte whispered, but she already knew her mother well enough to guess. She said, Then we do what we must, and we pray that he becomes a better man through his suffering than he ever was through his success." Walter turned to face Charlotte, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your mother loved your father until the day she died. She married again, yes, and found happiness. But she never stopped grieving for the man your father could have been if he'd just valued what he had." Charlotte felt tears streaming down her own face, but she didn't wipe them away, letting them fall as tribute to her mother's complicated heart. "She never told me that. She always spoke about him so clinically, so distantly. I thought she'd stopped loving him the moment he betrayed her. That's what she wanted everyone to think, including you, especially you. She didn't want you to grow up believing that love meant accepting betrayal, that loyalty meant tolerating abuse, that forgiveness meant reconciliation." Walter moved closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. But late at night, when she thought no one was watching, she would look at that wedding photograph and cry for what they'd lost, not because she regretted her choices, but because she mourned the death of potential, the waste of what could have been beautiful. "Did my father know?" Charlotte asked, needing to understand if her father had carried this knowledge to his grave. "No. Your mother made me promise never to tell him, never to let him think that revealing her feelings might change anything. She said he needed to learn to value things that were lost, not things that might still be available. She was afraid that if he knew she still loved him, he'd use that love as a tool rather than treating it as the gift it had been." Walter paused, his next words careful. "But about 6 months before he died, your father came to see me. He was sick by then, the cancer already spreading, but his mind was clear. He asked me to give you something after you'd established yourself as Venture Corps' CEO. Walter reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. But Charlotte's name was written across it, in her father's distinctive handwriting. "He made me promise to wait until you were strong enough to lead the company, until you'd proven you inherited your mother's wisdom rather than his arrogance. I've been waiting for this moment for 8 years, watching you build on your mother's legacy while avoiding your father's mistakes." Charlotte took the envelope with trembling hands, but she didn't open it immediately, feeling the weight of her father's final message. "What does it say?" "I don't know. He sealed it in front of me and made me swear I wouldn't read it. But he said to tell you that it contained the only wisdom he'd earned through his suffering, and that if you ever felt yourself becoming arrogant like he'd been, you should read it and remember where arrogance leads." Walter turned to leave, his mission complete, but Charlotte stopped him. "Mr. Morrison, wait. Thank you for serving my mother so faithfully all those years. Thank you for being the architect of my father's fall, because without it, he never would have become the man he was at the end. Flawed and regretful, yes, but also humble and loving and present in ways he never was before." Charlotte's voice broke, but she pushed through. "My father's greatest gift to me wasn't any inheritance or wisdom. It was showing me what not to become. And you helped give him the circumstances that made that lesson possible." Walter's eyes glistened, but his professional composure held. "Your mother was the most remarkable woman I ever represented. Your father was the most tragic man I ever destroyed. And you, Charlotte, are the perfect synthesis of both their strengths, without either of their weaknesses. That's the real victory in this story. Not that your mother exposed your father's arrogance, but that their daughter transcended both their failures." After Walter left, Charlotte sat alone in the boardroom, her father's letter unopened on the table before her, but she wasn't ready to read it yet. Instead, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through the photographs she'd collected over the years. Images of her parents at different stages of their lives, separately and together, happy and broken, young and old. There was her mother at 30, 8 months pregnant, standing in front of Venture Core Technologies with an expression of quiet power that suggested she'd just saved the company from her husband's mismanagement. There was her father at 40, gaunt and humbled, holding Charlotte for the first time in that sterile visitation center, his face a mask of regret and desperate love. There was her mother at 50, remarried and content, standing with her second husband and Charlotte at her college graduation, but her eyes carried shadows that suggested old wounds never fully healed. And there was her father at 65, 6 months before the cancer diagnosis, sitting with Charlotte's own children, his grandchildren, reading them stories with a patience and presence he'd never shown Charlotte when she was young, but which he'd cultivated through years of therapy and self-reflection. That photograph always made Charlotte cry because it showed what her father could have been all along if he'd just valued the right things from the beginning. Charlotte finally opened her father's letter, the paper crackling with age, but his handwriting was steady despite the illness that had been killing him. She read slowly, absorbing every word. "My dearest Charlotte, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've proven yourself worthy of leading Venture Core. I'm proud of you in ways I can never adequately express. Proud that you inherited your mother's brilliance without her need to hide it. Proud that you learned from my mistakes without becoming bitter. Proud that you're the leader I pretended to be but never actually was. I want to tell you the truth about the morning I called your mother worthless, because I've never told anyone what I was really thinking in that moment, and I need you to understand how insidious arrogance can be. When I said your mother was worthless, I actually believed it, not because I was trying to hurt her, though I did hurt her terribly, but because I had genuinely convinced myself that value was measured by visible achievement, by public recognition, by the markers of success that society applauds. Your mother stayed home, raised you, kept the house, supported my career, all things I had decided were less important than my work, my deals, my public victories. What I didn't understand until it was too late was that your mother wasn't staying home because she lacked ambition or capability. She was choosing to invest her time and energy in our family, while secretly running an empire I never even noticed. She was operating at a level so far above my comprehension that I mistook her restraint for weakness, her patience for passivity, her love for dependence. I called her worthless because I couldn't see worth that wasn't performing for my benefit. I mistook Amanda's aggressive ambition for strength, her visible hunger for drive, her willingness to betray for loyalty to me. I was a fool, Charlotte, but I was a fool who believed his own press releases, who thought success justified selfishness, who convinced himself that he deserved whatever he wanted simply because he was winning at a game whose rules he didn't understand. When your mother revealed who she really was, when she showed me that everything I thought I'd built was actually her creation, her investment, her strategy, my first emotion wasn't shame or regret, it was rage. Rage that she'd deceived me, rage that she'd let me believe I was in control, rage that she'd revealed my powerlessness in front of everyone I needed to respect me. It took me years to understand that my rage was actually wounded pride, that my sense of betrayal was actually shame at being exposed, that my pain was nothing compared to what I'd inflicted on your mother. She'd hidden her power to give me a chance to love her for herself. I'd hidden my inadequacy by claiming credit for her work. We'd both kept secrets, but hers came from hope, while mine came from fear. The lesson I learned too late, the wisdom I paid everything to acquire, is this: arrogance is just fear wearing a crown. I was terrified of being ordinary, terrified of being revealed as less than special, terrified that without external validation, I would simply cease to exist. So I built an identity based on false foundations, and when those foundations crumbled, I had nothing left but the truth of who I actually was, flawed, frightened, and finally ready to become something real. Your mother gave me the greatest gift anyone ever gave me, Charlotte. She broke me so completely that I had to rebuild from honest materials. She destroyed my false self so my true self had room to grow. She loved me enough to let me fail, to let me face consequences, to let me discover that I could survive being ordinary and even find peace in it. I hope you never need the kind of brutal education I received. I hope you recognize worth before you destroy it. Value love before you betray it. Understand that quiet strength is still strength, that hidden power is still power, that people who don't perform for your approval might still be the most valuable people in your life. But if you do find yourself becoming arrogant, if you catch yourself dismissing people who don't serve your immediate needs, if you start believing your own mythology, remember me. Remember what I lost. Remember that I called the most valuable person in my life worthless. And remember that by the time I understood my mistake, it was too late to undo it. I could only become someone worthy of her forgiveness, not someone who deserved her love. I loved your mother every day from the moment I realized what I'd lost until the moment I died. But I loved her best after I stopped trying to win her back, after I accepted that some things can't be fixed, after I focused on being the father you deserved, rather than the husband I'd failed to be. You are my redemption, Charlotte, not because you're successful or brilliant or powerful, though you're all of those things, but because you're proof that even my terrible mistakes could produce something beautiful. You're the argument that my life mattered despite all evidence to the contrary. You're the reason I kept trying to become better, even when better would never be enough. Lead VentureCore with your mother's wisdom and your own vision. Don't hide your power the way she did, but don't wield it the way I did either. Find the balance between humility and confidence, between strength and compassion, between justice and mercy. And if you ever meet someone who calls you worthless, remember that their blindness says everything about them and nothing about you. I'm sorry I never got to be the father you deserved from the beginning. I'm grateful you gave me the chance to be the father I became at the end. And I'm proud beyond measure of the woman you are, strong without being cruel, successful without being arrogant, powerful without being blind to the worth of others. Your mother was never worthless. I was worthless for saying it. She was priceless. I learned that too late to save our marriage, but early enough to save myself. Take that lesson forward, Charlotte. Let it guide you when ambition tempts you to dismiss people who don't serve your immediate agenda. Let it remind you that the quiet people in the corner might be the most powerful people in the room, choosing restraint over display, substance over show, love over ego. I love you, Charlotte. I always have, even when I was too broken to show it properly. Thank you for being my daughter. Thank you for forgiving me even when I couldn't forgive myself. Thank you for becoming proof that people can change, that redemption is possible, that even the worst mistakes can eventually produce wisdom worth sharing. Live well, love wisely, value worth wherever you find it, and never ever call anyone worthless, because that word destroys both the person who says it and the person who hears it, leaving nothing but ashes where something beautiful could have grown. With all my love and all my regrets, Dad, Charlotte read the letter 3 times, tears flowing freely, but by the third reading she felt something shift inside her, a final piece of understanding clicking into place. Her father hadn't been a villain who became a hero, nor a hero who became a villain. He'd been a human being who made catastrophic choices, faced devastating consequences, and slowly, painfully, transformed himself into someone better. Her mother hadn't been a perfect woman who destroyed an evil man. She'd been a brilliant, complicated person who had hidden her power for love, revealed it for justice, and spent the rest of her life balancing mercy with accountability, forgiveness with boundaries, compassion with consequence. And Charlotte herself wasn't the child of a cautionary tale or the inheritor of a revenge plot. She was the living synthesis of her parents' combined wisdom. Her mother's strategic brilliance and her father's hard-won humility, her mother's fierce strength and her father's learned compassion, her mother's understanding of true worth and her father's appreciation for what he'd lost. Charlotte folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope, but she knew she would read it many more times throughout her life. Whenever she felt herself becoming too confident, too dismissive, too ready to judge others by their utility rather than their humanity, her father's words would serve as a perpetual reminder that arrogance was just one decision away, that calling someone worthless was easier than recognizing worth, that destroying what you have in pursuit of what you want was the defining tragedy of too many lives. As Charlotte gathered her materials and prepared to leave the boardroom, she looked one last time at the photograph of her parents on their wedding day. But now she saw it differently, not as the before picture in a tragedy, but as evidence that love was always real, even when it wasn't enough, that potential was always present, even when it wasn't realized, that people contained multitudes, capable of both magnificent love and devastating betrayal, brilliant vision and catastrophic blindness, profound wisdom and spectacular foolishness. Her father had called her mother worthless and learned she was priceless. Her mother had been called worthless and proven she was invaluable. And Charlotte, standing in the boardroom of the empire her mother had built, and her father had helped through his cautionary failure, understood that the story wasn't really about revenge or justice or consequence. It was about the cost of not seeing worth until it's lost, the price of valuing appearance over substance, and the terrible grace of second chances that come too late to undo damage but early enough to transform disaster into wisdom. It was about how love without respect crumbles, how success without integrity corrupts, and how power without compassion destroys everything it touches. But most importantly, it was about how even the worst mistakes could become teaching moments, how even the most painful failures could produce valuable lessons, and how even a man who called his pregnant wife worthless while dumping her for his secretary could eventually transform his catastrophic error into hard-won wisdom that would echo through generations, saving others from walking the path that had destroyed him. Charlotte turned off the lights and closed the boardroom door, carrying her father's letter and her mother's legacy forward into a future neither of them would see. But both had shaped through their choices, his terrible and hers brilliant, his destructive and hers constructive, but both ultimately human, flawed, and worthy of being remembered not as saints or villains, but as people who taught the world that worth is not determined by who sees it, value is not dependent on who acknowledges it, and that sometimes the most worthless thing about calling someone worthless is revealing the poverty of your own ability to recognize treasure when it's standing right in front of you. The lesson had cost her father everything and given Charlotte everything, but she would spend the rest of her life ensuring that others learned it more cheaply, shared it more widely, and understood more deeply that in the end, the only thing truly worthless is the arrogance that blinds us to the worth of others, and that arrogance, once recognized and rejected, could transform into the humility that makes real love, real success, and real worth finally possible.